Today is Friday, May 29th, 2015, and we are here to interview Sister Maureen Mulcrone.
Yes.
Our first question is, we would like to know more, or would like to know about your journey in faith. What led you to a religious calling?
Well, I grew up in a Catholic family. My father actually had been a seminarian at Notre Dame before he left there, and our family was able to send us to Catholic school. I went to Immaculate Heart of Mary School in Northwest Detroit. There I met the Sisters of Mercy, and I just found myself thinking as a child that I had a sense of God's presence, and these people also did, and I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be like these smart, witty, compassionate, friendly people. That's the kind of person I want to be. So I'm still working on that. But that's what led me to become a Sister of Mercy.
I like the word witty.
Yes, there was a lot of humor.
I have humor.
And that is characteristic, I think, of the community in many cases. Catherine Macaulay, we're told, had a great wit, and she would write, sometimes kind of humorous verses, or she would. I remember she wrote to one novice saying, "We'll form a foolery club," or something like that. And she knew that at the time, letters back and forth would have been read by the superior, so sometimes she would put something in the letter to the novice that was really meant to be read by the superior as a little nudge and a little joke, not to get too strict, not to, as she said, do not draw the string too tight or it will break. So she always had a sense of the humanness of the people she was working with and the struggles that they faced, and her approach was to deal with that with compassion and wit and understanding. And I experienced that. And for example, all these stories you hear about kids being hit in schools and that, I have to say I never saw a child hit. Now, I can't say that every single Sister of Mercy was someone I wanted to emulate, but the ones that were more severe were so clearly out of the norm that I knew that in general that this was a group that I wanted to be affiliated with.
Well, that's kind of segues into our next question is, why Sisters of Mercy over other religious orders?
Probably because my experience with religious communities up until I was 18 or 17 was pretty much exclusively with Sisters of Mercy. Now, the one exception was that after 8th grade, during 8th grade, I was going around to different schools and Catholic schools for girls, and I visited several. At one, I felt condescended to. I'm not going to mention the community name, and I'm not going to suggest either that that was characteristic of them, but the particular person I met is not someone who inspired me to consider that school further. So when I was admitted to Mercy High School, I continued my relationship with Sisters of Mercy, met new sisters, and in my and continued to have that sense that I wanted to be a Sister of Mercy. But then, I got to be a senior in high school, and that just didn't seem like a cool idea at all anymore. But Sister Kenise Johnson, who was one of my teachers, I think had her eye on me. As I said at her vigil service the other night, I said we didn't call it stalking then, but she was pretty persistent in encouraging me to think about the community. And when I was kind of backing off, she said, well, why don't you go to the chapel every day for 15 minutes and pray about it and see what happens. And so I did that. I went each day after school, prayed for 15 minutes. And gradually I discovered that when I was moving in the direction of entering the community, I felt at peace. And when I was moving in the direction of not entering the community, I didn't feel at peace. Now today we call that discernment.
Right.
I didn't know a word for it, I just knew that this was my experience. And so that confirmed my decision, and fortunately I had a number of friends who also were at Mercy High School who decided to enter the community. And there were 4 of us. 51 years later, there are only the same 4 of us from Mercy High School who remained in the community. The oldest and youngest members of our class, who were from Iowa, one are both dead. The others have left the community, but many of them remain good friends. They came to our Jubilee celebration last year. They're interested in what's happening to the sisters. I'm having lunch with a couple of them next week, so we keep in touch.
So, about what year then did you become a nun?
I entered the community in 1964.
Let's see. Oh, that was the tumultuous year.
Well, it was the beginning
of it.
Tumultuous years after the Second Vatican Council. And it was also a blip in the experiences of religious communities, because we had large classes. There were 25 in my group. I think there were 36 in the group that entered the next year. And then a few years later, we're looking at 6, 12, 1, 3, and people thought, oh, that's a change. But in fact, when you look at it from the vantage of 50 years later, and even 30 or 40 years later, and research has been done on this, you can see that that period in which you had 25 and 35 sisters entering at a single time was really, that was the blip. That was the exception to the norm.
As you were going through your training, what did you study?
Well, we were expected to go to college because our community was primarily, in the 60s, focused on teaching and healthcare. And while they would have said, you'll become a teacher or a nurse, that was pretty much true. Then people went on to do other things eventually. So I took a standard liberal arts course of study at Mercy College, but we also were expected, in addition to whatever our major and minor was, to have minors in philosophy and theology. And so we spent 5 years in college because we entered the community as postulants, as we called them at the time. We did our first year of college work. The second year in the community, we were what's called canonical novices. This is a required year in the church's structure for young religious to have a time that's focused on prayer and exploration of the community history and charism, rather than focused on external ministry. There's a little ministry in that canonical year, but not nearly as much as in other parts of the process of incorporation and in our lives as they continue in the community. So that was the year we had more intensive study in philosophy and theology. And it was a wonderful time to be doing that because the Vatican Council was just over, the documents were out, we had documents on religious life that encouraged us to go back to the roots of our community, to look at the founding charism and spirit of those communities, and to get rid of the accretions that had attached themselves to the community life over the years. And this was encouraged of all religious communities, men, women, throughout the world. In the United States, religious women's communities, by and large, really took that seriously. And that's not to say that the men didn't. I just know more of the women's experience. But you can see that the Jesuits also did that because their focus became much more on social justice. As we looked at our roots with Catherine Macaulay, she was, her community was one of the first in which sisters did not remain in the cloister. Now, at least several other women in the century before her had tried to break out of that cloister and to have communities be out among the people. But our church is sometimes slow to understand strong women and slow to let them out of the constraints that they had tended to impose on us. And so those women eventually ended up back cloistered. Catherine Macaulay, when she was doing this ministry with women of the area, including younger people, her niece and her niece's friends, her friends, they would go out and visit people in their homes. And these were people who were desperately, desperately poor. They would visit people in prisons. And if you know the history of Ireland in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when Catherine Macaulay would have been alive, they were just coming to the end of the penal laws, which kept Catholics from getting an education, from owning property, from taking political office. All of those things were beginning to change. And Catherine had seen her father express concern for poor children and try to offer them at least religious education, which he would personally teach. But he died when she was young, and her mother, who came from a family of relative comfort, like so many single women today, was not prepared economically to take over and support the family. And their resources disappeared. Catherine and her siblings were farmed out to other families and other family members. Her mother died, and about the age of 17 or 18, Catherine was without parents and living with another family. Now, she didn't have a comfortable financial existence, and so she needed employment. And she was offered a position, you might think of it as sort of a household manager or an executive housekeeper or something like that, by a couple who lived just outside Dublin, who were involved in healthcare, and her uncles had been involved in healthcare, so that's how she got to know the Callahan family. And they invited her to come and live with them and run their household, which she did. And she remembered what her father had done for poor children, and she started to do that kind of concern for them. And she was also trying to find her way more deeply into her own faith, because some of her family members were no longer Catholic. It wasn't fun being a Catholic in Ireland at that time. It was very exclusionary, and being a Catholic meant being excluded from a lot of things. And so she was trying to find her way more deeply into what it was that God was calling her to do. Now, the Callahans were not Catholics. They were good people, and she obviously loved them, and they loved her, and were impressed with what she did, not only for them, but for these children around her. And when they died, they both independently converted to Catholicism, but they also left her just about their entire estate. So suddenly she had money, and instead of going on a cruise in the Canary Islands or something else, she went back into the city, bought a piece of property, hired an architect to build a building where she and other women could come and stay for as long as they wanted and minister to the poor and the sick. So she wanted to continue doing that, and it wasn't a religious community, but as I said, sometimes our church doesn't understand strong women, and she got a little flack from some clerics who thought that if they were going to be doing this ministry, they ought to be nuns and be in a cloister. But the Archbishop, who was a friend of hers, suggested that to preserve the ministry, she should found a religious community. And she did, but one of the agreements that she struck with him was that her sisters would not be cloistered, and they would be able to continue to go out into the homes of the poor and into the prisons. And because of that, her sisters became known as the Walking Nuns, because they were out among the people, visiting them where the needs were.
And you continue that tradition today.
I remember my very first mission, as it was called, when I was in Independence, Iowa, a small town. As I read the archives, when the sisters got there, the very first afternoon, they went out to visit people to find out where the needs were. And that's what we strive to do, to see what are the unmet needs in our society. How can we bring God's mercy and love and compassion to those people?
Thank you. I'm going to change just slightly now. What was your role at Mercy College?
Well, I was a student in Mercy College, and at least one summer, I participated in a program that we had for students, primarily coming from what we called then the inner city, and they were students who were struggling with the academic levels they needed to succeed in college, and so I was a part of a program to help them make that transition more successfully. And
like a tutor, a mentee?
I taught writing. I was in a more tutorial setting.
Sorry.
Yeah. And incidentally, while I was at Mercy College, and Sister Denise Johnson was also there, we would go over to DeHoco, the Detroit House of Correction, and we would teach English to women there. So that was another way of extending the ministry of education to those who would not be coming to college anytime soon.
Now, was that in Detroit at the time?
It was on the outskirts of Detroit, the prison was, yeah.
Yes, that's what I thought. Do you have a favorite story or a memory about your time at Mercy?
I had a really good time in college. I just think of it with affection. Some of the things I remember are working with other people in journalism. I had a minor in journalism as well. Well, it wasn't a minor, but a credential in journalism as well. And I enjoyed being a part of creating the paper. That had been a part of my high school experience at Mercy College also. And writing has been a part of my life and my profession forever. So that was fun to meet people. And I don't think there were any other sisters involved in journalism at the time, so these were all people outside the community. I also remember running a campaign for one of our sisters to be elected to whatever the student government was at that time. And we came up with some creative ways to shape her name into a circle, and her name is one half of the circle, and the other half of the circle was the position she was running for. Very Beatles looking, kind of Art and Peter Max sort of thing. So I remember seeing, I can't think of his name right now, he taught Art, seeing one of these things hanging as a mobile from the down a stairwell, and kind of looking up at this to see what this new art was.
So being a sister doesn't mean you can't enjoy pop culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was the growth of Motown.
Right.
So we were listening to different music. We were privileged to have in our religious community class a woman who was African American, who was, I think, the first to enter the community in Detroit. And so that too brought us, helped us to connect more with people of color. Our schools were in the city, but at the time the city was still very, very segregated. So we made a connection with St. Cecilia's Parish, and we would go down there and work with children there as well. That would have been while I was at Mercy College. I'm not sure it was a program of the college, more of the community.
Okay.
Let me just ask you, how long do you want to do this? I could probably tell you stories forever.
Well, our tape limit's an hour.
Okay,
But,
then you get to what you want most importantly.
I'm not sure this question is appropriate, but I'm going to ask it. As a sister of Mercy, what impact did your work have on the students at Mercy College? So,
Well,
maybe as a fellow student.
mm-hmm. I think it gave people an opportunity to see other people their age interacting. I can remember suddenly I'm getting this flood of memories. It was some English course. We're all sitting out on the grass having a class, and I'm in a habit, but everybody else is not. Now, once in a while, there were a few conflicts. Some movie came out that virtually everyone in the collegiate world had seen, but I hadn't, because we didn't go to movies. No, so were there one or two things that I just was out of the discussion.
Right.
But by and large, and some of those friendships with professors included outside of the classroom. I can remember having David Hill out to dinner my senior year at the convent I lived in Berkeley, and I can remember visiting another professor with another sister in his home and for dinner and things like that. So things were loosening up a little bit. That would have been unthinkable before for sisters in the formation process to be interacting that way. So this was really a change. We look at Pope Francis now saying, "Wake up the world, go out," and it's almost like an echo of the experience then when structures were changing. There was greater call for involvement of the laity in the ministry of the church, and that meant more interaction with our lay colleagues. Now I know sisters are part of the laity, but we often get treated in a different way. So here was a chance to, for people my own age who might have had no idea what it was like to be a sister, who might only have met sisters in their grade schools and told some of the stories that we've all heard, to see us as human beings first. I hope it was a positive experience.
Of course.
Well, I do remember one specific thing where we were talking about this one professor, Paul Glamour, I think his name was, and the Beatles had gone off to India to do meditation and that, and so people were talking about meditation. Well, in the community, we had been meditating now for as many years as we had been members of the community, so we had that experience. The other young people around us, they didn't have that at all, so that was something they could look to us for and say, "Oh, how do you do that?" Well, we can show you.
How has the ministry of the Sisters of Mercy changed over the years?
I think the greatest change that we've seen might be called a movement away from the institutionalized ministries that were so much a part of religious communities in this country in its earlier years. The Sisters of Mercy established the first permanent hospital west of the Allegheny Mountains in Pittsburgh. When I entered the community, the Sisters of Mercy of Detroit had probably 40 hospitals in Michigan and Iowa and Indiana. We had a college, we had high schools. I served for roughly 20 years in either governance or management or both in Mercy Health Services, which became Trinity Health. But as we got further along in that, I would say in the 90s, fewer and fewer of our sisters, especially those younger ones entering, were interested in working in those institutionalized ministries. They wanted to go back to the roots and be out in the neighborhoods of the poor, and that's part of what we did. We looked at our history as religious women after the Second Vatican Council and said, maybe we should be changing. And so today, you may have sisters sitting on boards, but I can't think of a single Sister of Mercy in the Detroit area who is actually working in a hospital anymore or administering it. And so Sister Mary Kelly's work in looking at that transition, and the article she published just a couple months ago looks at that transition of religious women out of leadership of healthcare and the transition of that leadership to laity. So that's, I think, the most significant thing, is that change in focus of ministry from highly institutionalized to much more diverse. And that meant more diverse in the kind of work we did, too. So instead of being teachers or nurses only, people, or healthcare administrators, or college and high school administrators, people were now getting degrees in social work. In my own class of religious life, we had someone who, at the master's level, got an MBA, got a master's in divinity, got a master's in broadcasting, became a physician, all of those things which were not common before. They were not necessarily the first in every case, but to have that diversity rather than a master's in education, a master's in education, a master's in nursing, a master's in, so it became much more diverse in the kind of study that we did and the way we brought those gifts to bear on ministerial needs.
How do you live out the mission of the Sisters of Mercy? The mission of the University of Detroit Mercy, because you are connected. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then how are they interrelated?
Well, I think they're highly interrelated. my daytime ministry, if you want to put it that way, is in raising money for Mercy Education Project. And Mercy Education Project is an example of that change. Now, it is an institution, but a small one. That change in ministry from teaching in high school to Mercy Education Project providing remedial education and life skills development to low-income girls and women in Detroit. And I worked there as a volunteer. I taught writing to women who didn't have a high school education. I went on as a volunteer to help them develop a strategic plan and ended up becoming the director of development for almost 12 years. So that was a kind of ministry there. Along the way, I had also been on the board of Mercy College, and was on the board when we made the transition and formed a collaborative entity to become the University of Detroit Mercy. And I continued on the board to serve several other terms there as we were pulling that together. Today, I'm a member of the Board of Advisors for the College of Business Administration. And one of the things that I see as important in my role there is that we are helping, first of all, to broaden the number of students who can come into business administration. We're hoping to provide a strong ethical background for people who will be business leaders. And we're encouraging social entrepreneurism. At the last meeting of the board, there was a young woman who had started a nonprofit entity. And so we heard a presentation about her work. And these are people who want to get involved in their community, taking a problem and solving it in an entrepreneurial way. So it's good to see that being fostered at the university as well, because there are so many needs. And if we're not finally reaching out into the university population and providing a sensitivity, it's all students, to those needs, and encouraging them to use their gifts to try to identify how to solve some of these pervasive problems. What do you do when you have an underclass of people who cannot get out of poverty? How do you change that? You certainly don't want to encourage people to accept that as that's the way it is. So how do you help people understand how they can bring their gifts to bear on those challenges? So it's very much continuing the work of Catherine McCauley to say, who are those most in need? Who are the poor? Who are the sick? Who are the uneducated? How do we help them get into the mainstream of society?
This isn't really scripted.
I
know. As you were speaking, I had a thought. 25 years later, what is your impression of the merger? Successful?
Certainly successful, yes. I think that by and large, not entirely, but by and large, we moved beyond separate camps. I think from the beginning, some people came together and said, we think this is best for the city, we think it's best for higher education in the city, and we're going to make it work. And then there's always a spectrum. People who strongly opposed and resistant, and then everybody in between. And I think that the resistance has by and large crumbled. There are some people who are still would like to see, I think, the name Mercy dropped and go back to the old U of T. Not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
And there are some people who feel that the Mercy College side was shortchanged. Nothing is perfect in this world. And I think there was very strong effort to bring together those two groups. When I first was on the board, we had some board members who would never say the full name of the university. On the other hand, our Jesuit brothers always said it to reinforce University of Detroit Mercy. And gradually, even the sports announcers are starting to use the full name of the university. Not consistently, but better than before.
Well, they dropped the university, so they're just saying Detroit Mercy.
That's fine.
That's fine.
As long as we get both hands in.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that we can be very proud of having taken two organizations and put them together into a stronger single organization, and one that is committed to remaining in the city and has become, I think, over the years, even more focused on being a successful urban institution that really tries to make a difference in the city.
I know you're not retired. So how are you spending your time? I know over the course of this conversation, you told us a lot of things that you've done and are doing, but can you just focus on what you're doing now to kind of tie it up for us?
Sure. On a more personal note, you know that Sister Mary Kelly's illness made a big difference in my life this year, because we were living together and we needed to move in order to find a place that was more accommodating for her treatment. And the community allowed me to be involved in a more supportive way in helping her through her treatment, so that I'm not in a full-time ministry, especially in development, working 70 hours a week and trying to do this. But I do, after I left Mercy Education Project, the director's position, and had a sabbatical year to do some more exploration of our own community and spirituality and some other study and relaxation. I also have a mother who's 95 and a half, so I helped care for her. And so that is a mix of sometimes specifically focused at Mercy Education Project, sometimes specifically focused in the past on helping Mary with all of her appointments and so on, and with my mother. Now, just shifting that again, and I can be more helpful to Mercy Education Project. I can remain with the university on the board, and I see myself as an active member of the university and very concerned about its history and its future, wanting to see it thrive. So I'll be at a basketball game, I'll be at another event if I can, I'll eat the chili.
Chili bake-off.
Yeah, right.
Did you go to the theater?
Yes, in fact, we had season tickets, and so I try to be involved in quite a number of things with the university. The president was kind enough to invite me to most of the college-wide or university-wide events. So I would go to the Christmas party, I would go to some of the other donor events and things like that.
Okay.
So I don't know that really wraps it up in any nicely packaged way for you, but continue to be involved in our Ministry of Mercy, Mercy Education Project, and also at the university.
Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
Is there anything that you would like to tell us that we haven't asked?
Let me have that one percolate. Let me ask me your next question and come back
Okay.
to that.
We were going to be interviewing Sister Kenny's on Monday, and listening, it seems like it's been a real loss. Her death has been a real loss. So even though this isn't really part of our initial interview, we would like to try to piece not an interview, but try to piece her life to yes. And anyway, so we want to start asking our interviewees rather, to share something, to share a memory with us about Sister Kenny's.
I've known Sister Kitty since I was 17 years old. She was an English teacher. She was the one who encouraged me to find my way through discernment into the community. I had many other wonderful teachers who were also a part of that. But Kenise also happened to be teaching at Mercy College when I was there. And on the day Martin Luther King was killed, we were in her class in linguistics. She had gotten a doctorate in linguistics, and her focus in that was on I don't even know the right language for this, but something like sociological implications and cultural implications of what we would today call people of color in the classroom, language and people of color in the classroom. So even then, her interest in trying to look at exclusionary practices in a country that has a history of racism and trying to somehow bring that to bear in the ministry was starting even then, and that would have been in the 1960s. I remember, I'll never forget that that's where I was when Martin Luther King was killed. Yes, and as I look back on Kenice's life, when the week before she died, she was in front of the Detroit City Council arguing for the necessity to provide a more consistent way to have water for people who are poor. We had just agreed that we would read a book together about another dimension of the ecological world. Kenice became a vegetarian because she wanted to eat lower on the food chain and have less of an impact on the world. She was committed to education throughout her whole life and was responsible for maintaining and getting accredited East Catholic High School when it was having no support from the Archdiocese. And when the Archdiocese closed all the Catholic schools, high schools, except the two that were run by Jesuits, she felt a need to have another school. And without her, there would not be a Detroit Cristo Rey school today, because she led the committee to do the research and the planning and get the things in place that would allow them to replicate that model in Detroit. She was the founding executive director of Mercy Education Project. So again, she was working with students who hadn't succeeded in school, helping girls and women to come into the mainstream through education. And so I have great admiration for her. And in fact, when I was planting my tomatoes, she she wanted to live more easily on the earth. And I've been gardening for 20 years, organically, 20 plus. And she would have a little garden, and usually I'd buy the tomato seedlings and give them to her. And we had lunch up here in my house about 3 weeks ago, the week before she died, actually. And she said, and I don't think I'm going to get a garden planted this year. I said, well, I'll give you tomatoes, and I'll take care of that. So I won't be planting tomatoes for her, but I will be seeding her memory throughout the ministries that we do, and hoping that we can continue to have the impact that she did and beyond that.
Was it a hard transition going from Sister Kenice being your instructor, your teacher, to becoming a colleague, a friend?
Yeah, a colleague and a friend.
Colleague and a friend.
That's a tough transition when you're 18 years old.
Yeah.
But and I don't remember the specifics of it, but I suppose in her class while I was in college, I might help with things a little bit extra, but I was doing that not just as a student. We were also common members in the community.
Racing the chalkboard?
Well, maybe something like that. I can remember when I was doing my own graduate study and I was doing a survey on something, and she had just done her doctorate. She said, "Oh, let me see your survey. I'm interested in the tools." So I showed her my survey, and she gave me some copies and things like that. So we had a lot of common interests, and we were just fortunate it worked for us, to do that.
To kind of bring you back to my last question,
Yeah,
have you had time to think about, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you really want to tell us?
I think I'd simply emphasize again the importance of witness. Without the witness of the sisters that I saw in grade school, in high school, I wouldn't be a Sister of Mercy. Now, I think at that time most women entered religious communities because they came from high school, they had that experience. Today, very few young women have the experience of having a sister or having a brother or having a priest as a teacher before college. So we have to look for other ways to have our presence known. One of those, I think, is there's a Jesuit volunteer corps, there's a Mercy volunteer corps. And I find that that is how young people now tend to encounter us. They're very interested in ministry, and they want to work in ministry among the most deprived people in our society. So we have consistently these volunteers at Mercy Education Project, for example. That's how they come into contact. And the beauty of it is that then they enrich us with, many times they become associates. Sometimes they marry each other as Mercy, after being Mercy Volunteer Corps members, and they stay in the city, or they come back to the city and they connect with the community. So that's a wonderful new manifestation, I think, of that collaboration in ministry that the Second Vatican Council called for, that we've tried to implement on the way, and we're seeing flower in a new way today.
Well, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
And this.
I'm sorry, I should have been looking
Oh,
over
no,
here
no,
too.
no,
That
no.
I-
I'm supposed to be the silent one here.
Okay.
But a couple of things that you said made me wonder. So, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. I was just wondering, okay, say it's 25 years down the road, where do you see the Sisters of Mercy? We were talking before about how many of the sisters were running the hospitals, and now they've pulled back from that and they're involved in other things. In the future, do you have an idea where you think things might be headed, or?
Yes, I think the call in the whole church, and we're seeing this with Pope Francis, is to get away from some of the pompousness that has become a part of the church over centuries, and to go back to the simple message of the gospel and preaching that, as St. Francis said, by every means possible, even using words if you need to. But clearly the idea is be a witness, be an example. And I think that the whole church will be challenged by that, and will be a stronger and better church, even if possibly a smaller church for some who cannot hear and bring that message into their heart. I think for Sisters of Mercy, it will mean to, in some ways, go back to what we were doing before. Now, I think Mercy Education is like that. It's very close, direct to people's lives. If Catherine McCauley were alive, I used to say, writing grants, I think she'd be working there, rather than probably in a hospital or maybe even at the university. But it's important to have that full spectrum of educational influence, so that people are not just having religious influence in their elementary years, but that their faith life grows and develops in the same way that their intellectual and their social and spiritual, psychological life grows. So to have that reinforced then in secondary school, to have it reinforced at the university level, I think is very important for the work that we're doing at University of Detroit Mercy. Because sometimes people's faith life doesn't develop. It stays at that elementary school level, and all the other facets of their lives get to be adults, but this is still a child. So I think what we're doing is, first of all, being a witness with our lives, being a presence of compassion to people who are most in need. But then, from the perspective of the university, to continue to help people's faith life grow into adulthood and be applied in the world that we live in.
I'm doing I did the spiritual exercises
Great.
with Father Sai,
Uh-huh.
and we talk about that. We talk
Yeah.
about why do you feel your faith is what you had when you were 10 or 12.
But
You're
that
an
doesn't
adult,
change,
right?
yeah.
You know, you need to grow.
Yeah.
So much of, like, with all three interviews today, I don't see a whole lot of difference between the Jesuits and the Mercies as how they feel about maybe God and discernment
Well,
I'm hearing the same thing from
well,
you that I
that's
heard.
pretty good, I think, because we're coming out of the same gospel.
Yes.
You know, that's
Right.
the good news. That's
Right.
that's where we draw our inspiration. And I think another thing that is different today and going into the future is that we are more open to the ways that God manifests God's self in other religions. And I see it as kind of, this is an old-fashioned word, diadem, used to get used. But for me it has the implication of different things sparkling all around. And some of what's sparkling is what we bring through our Catholic tradition. But you know, there are going to be some lights from the Buddhists, and there are going to be some lights from Islam, and there are going to be some lights from other religious, from Jewish and our Protestant cousins as well. And I think today we can be more open to those. We don't have to be so defended against them, because we can be sure in the rightness of the gospel message for us. But I mean, can you think of Jesus saying, I don't want to hear about your religious experience? I can't imagine that. So I think it's an openness to say, how does God manifest in our world? What else can we learn about the wonderful presence of God? Pleasure
Thank
to
you.
sit with you.
Very much so. Enjoyed this very much.